Hey everyone, welcome to the Deep Cover Podcast. A little bit of explanation about this podcast, so if this is your first time tuning in, give you an idea of what we do here. So, if you follow me on deepcover.substack.com, you are familiar with the written articles of the Deep Cover website, and that is really centered around, looking beyond hot takes, looking beyond box scores, and having a higher level sports conversation, or at least trying to, right? So, in this podcast, we'll be kind of exploring that in a longer conversational form. We'll introduce a topic, talk about it for a little bit, and then I'll usually have a guest on afterwards to talk about it in more depth. So, for this first episode, we are going to be talking about the NCAA's number one all-time scorer in points in the women's game, and that's Caitlin Clark from Iowa. So I have my good friend Nick Andre from the Love of the Game podcast, who is going to be joining me in a little bit to talk about Caitlin Clark, talk about the WNBA, and to talk about women's basketball as a whole. But some of my thoughts on the whole Caitlin Clark phenomenon before we bring on Nick. So Caitlin Clark, to me, is a supernova. She is a player, a transcendent player that has taken the women's game by storm, and really basketball by storm. If you think about it, who's your go-to player in men's college basketball? This is going to be a pretty well documented, a weaker NBA draft. There's not really a Anthony Edwards style, Victor Wembanyama style player that's really going to be just shattering, taking the league by storm, and really being that blue chip prospect. There's a lot of good guys who are going to be role players, who are probably going to turn into all-stars some year, but there isn't a superstar, right? In the women's game, though, you do have that. You have Caitlin Clark, who is a national story. Angel Reese, also a national story. Paige Beckers in UConn is a really good player. So a lot of household names if you pay attention to the women's game, but what's so fascinating to me about Clark is that we have a player here who has limitless range. So she reminds you a little bit of Stephen Curry in that regard. She has great playmaking ability, excellent ball handling skills, and all wrap that up, has a swagger about her that is just infectious. Much like when you watch Damian Lillard play, or Stephen Curry play, or even Kyrie Irving play over the years, right? So what you have here is just somebody who is identifiable, box office, and she just recently declared for the NBA draft. And she is almost assuredly going to be the number one pick in the draft to the Indiana Fever, who also had the number one pick last year, who became Rookie of the Year in Aaliyah Boston from South Carolina. So what you're having here in the WNBA is Clark teaming up with Boston to create this interesting young dynamic duo. On top of that, you're also having a league where the Aces in Las Vegas and the Liberty in New York have built super teams, met in the finals last year. Wouldn't surprise anybody if they met in the finals again this coming season. The Seattle Storm have also acquired some free agents to be that third power team. So the WNBA is really banking on star power here. You got Kelsey Plum, AJ Wilson, Sabria Ionescu, Skylar Diggins-Smith, Jonquel Jones, all these great players in these teams. And it reminds me a little bit of the NBA in the 80s, where you had the Lakers and the Celtics as obviously the main two big rivals, and that's your Aces and Liberty. But you also had teams like the Pistons, teams like the 76ers, and that kind of slots into what Seattle is doing right now. Then eventually you had the Bulls, who had a great player on the up and up and trying to challenge those dominant players. And I know it sounds a lot like hyperbole, right, to compare Caitlin Clark to the greatest shooter of all time in Steph Curry, and arguably the greatest player in all time in Michael Jordan. But she has shown that she is transcendent in a way of advancing the women's game to heights that we haven't seen yet. In my conversation with Nick, we kind of talk about the 70s of the NBA and how maybe the WNBA is there, but it's entering into its 80s phase, its dynasty phase. And basketball has always been a game of superstars. We expect superstars to carry teams to championships. We expect them to dazzle us, right? a little bit unlike football, which is much more of a team orchestrated dynamic. You could have the greatest quarterback, but it doesn't matter if your defense sucks, right? But in basketball, a singular player could just take you to new heights that you might have never imagined. And so Caitlin Clark is going to be entering the league, and she very arguably could be the face of the league. Now, is that a good thing? Maybe. It could be a bad thing, right? It's a lot of pressure to put on a young 22-year-old. But if you watch Clark and you see the way that she handles herself, it's incredible. And she is incredible for being able to navigate the national circus that she's had at Iowa ever since a freshman. And she's been doing this, right? She has been hitting big shot after big shot after big shot since she was a freshman. And she could have stayed and arguably could have made more money in NIL, but she decided to jump to the WNBA because it was time. A number 1 overall pick. She gets to stay in the Midwest in Indiana. Clark is born and bred in Iowa, so she gets to stays in those kind of Midwest roots, right? But she has the potential to vault the WNBA to new heights because now you have the young upstart. Think Kevin Durant and Russell Westbrook on the Oklahoma City Thunder years ago to kind of challenge the predominant players in the league. And it's going to be an exciting summer in the WNBA. It's an exciting time in women's basketball. And the ironic thing is, while a lot of people love March Madness and they usually say it for the men's game, I think the more interesting tournament this year is the women's tournament. Because you get a lot of players that we know, right? Caitlin Clark, Angel Reese, Paige Beckers, Juju Watkins, all these players that have kind of grabbed national headlines. And ultimately, it's dispelling all these myths that, the WNBA game or the women's game as a whole, it's not exciting enough, that, there's not enough dunking, not enough athleticism. But the game of basketball has shifted to a shooting game, a skill game, right? So dribbling, shooting, passing, these are the skills now that dominate. In the NBA years ago, about 15, 20 years ago, it was all about if you could slash to the hoop and dunk, verticality, you were the guy, right? Nowadays, it's a lot more, can you shoot, right? And we know one thing, Caitlin Clark can shoot. So it's going to be incredibly exciting to watch her develop as a pro and also to see what she does with the Indiana Fever and what she does in the tournament. And ultimately what she does for the women's game of basketball as a whole, right? It's not only on her. We have a lot of young talent like Sabrina Ionescu. But there seems to be a wave here, some tide of the WNBA and women's basketball, just kind of going and elevating to new heights. And I'm excited to see it. I talk with Nick Andre next about the women's game, his experience as a fan of women's college basketball and the WNBA, and just the significance of Caitlin Clark as a whole. Stay tuned. We'll be right back with Nick Andre. Super excited to be bringing on this next guest, my first guest of this new podcast. When I was kind of starting this out, he was the first person I talked to, actually, and he was gracious enough to join me. One of my favorite up-and-coming writers, one of my favorite voices on basketball in general, but especially on women's basketball, is my man Nick Andre, host For the Love of the Game podcast, in addition to a variety of other written outlets that he's a part of. Nick, my man, how you doing?
I'm doing well, Omar. Thanks for having me. I feel really honored that I'm the first guest, man. So for you to reach out to me and ask me to be the first guest, man, I'm really excited, man. So thank you so much, man. I'm excited to get into everything that we're going to talk about.
Yeah, if you guys don't know, me and Nick have collaborated in the past. I've been on his podcast a couple times talking about the New York Knicks and a couple of other things. But as we are talking a little bit about Caitlin Clark and women's basketball, that is just so big in the news. It's crazy, Nick, because, March Madness is coming up for both men and women's. And I feel like the men's stuff has been super overshadowed by her breaking this record and all this stuff. It's just because, which I think is a big indictment on the men's game with all the one and done and NIL and all that stuff. But Caitlin has really gotten the spotlight here. And, she recently broke Kelsey Plum, who is obviously a big star in the WNBA now, her record when she was at Washington, and for the most points scored in NCAA women's history, and she's closing in, if she hasn't surpassed already, Pete Maravich's record as well for just overall. So, for what do you think is the significance of her breaking this record?
I think it's just the consistency and hard work that she brings to the table. She never cheats the game. You know, she always brings 100% every time she comes on, every time she steps on the floor. And I think the situation with her in Iowa is just really incredible. You know, they allow her to play her style of play, and there's a reason why she's a superstar. You know, people call her, or a lot of people they'll compare her to a Steph Curry or to another player, just because whenever she steps past half court, it's pretty much showtime. You know, she can just pull it there from, you know, like literally like from the half court line. She can get into the lane and score inside. You know, she's a really great playmaker. She's allowed, and she can get others involved. So Caitlin plays a huge role in this evolution of basketball, not even just women's basketball, but just basketball in general. And it shows that, you know, and you mentioning how the men's game has been kind of overshadowed, but I think now what we're seeing is that, you know, the women's game is competitive, which it always has been since the beginning of time. You know, we can go back to the 80s and the 70s and 60s. I mean, when Lynette Woodard of Kansas, she held the record for a long time, and she played even before, you know, this whole evolution. So I think Caitlin Clark plays a huge role in that. And for her to be able to do this, you know, in 4 years at Iowa is just really incredible.
Yeah, you know, you mentioned the Steph Curry correlation, which I think, you know, when you watch Caitlin, you see a lot of Steph, you see some Dame Lillard in there, right? And I think that's kind of showing another bit of evolution of the women's game, right? Because
Right.
people always joke about it. It was like, oh, I don't watch the. I think NBA player said this recently. I don't watch a women's game because they don't dunk, you know, or some stupid shit like that, right? And I think it was Michael Porter Jr. that said that. So
Yeah.
consider the source.
Yeah.
Yeah, but you know, her playing in that style, an NBA like style, is a little bit of a departure from what we've seen in women's college basketball and the WNBA as well. Do you think that kind of contributes to why people have gravitated toward her so much, or is it maybe I'm thinking a little too deep into it?
Well, first, I mean, we can definitely address the Michael Porter Jr. comments. You know, I mean, not even just him, but just other guys in general who don't appreciate watching women's games just because there's no dunks. And you know, that's more so like that's more of a casual fan talking. Like if you're like a real fan of basketball and you really love the game, then you'll see how, like, then you'll appreciate how much these women bring to the table. It's not just, you know, the 3-point shooting. It's not even just scoring overall. You know, it's the passing. It's just the high IQ for the game, understanding and being aware of everything that's going on the floor. So we have such a dynamic of great women's players who provide a lot to the table. You know, I can go on a list of a lot of names, even in today's WNBA and even in the past. But you know, as far as, you know, it's crazy. I can't even remember. Like I was thinking about Michael Porter Jr. So I can't even remember the original question. Can you say it again?
No, I mean, do you think her style, being that more NBA-ish style, kind of impacts why she's really just captivated the imagination of so many people, especially people that really haven't been super involved in women's basketball as a whole?
Yeah, I think so, honestly, because I think what it is that I think people love her drive, and I think that people love her competitiveness. You know, you see just a certain passion that she plays with, and she plays with a determination to win. And I think now, especially now that she's really been like on like this bigger spotlight, because for people who don't know, this is not new to Caitlin Clark. She's been doing this since she first started at Iowa. But I think a lot of people finally caught eyes on her last year during the NCAA tournament when Iowa got to the national championship, and then they beat obviously Don Staley, South Carolina, who was undefeated before then. So that was when Caitlin Clark really rose to the national outlet, you know, as far as basketball is in general. But you know, Caitlin's a competitor, and I think that's what makes you gravitate towards. I mean, it's what made a lot of people gravitate towards Michael Jordan and, you know, Kobe Bryant and LeBron James and so many others, because they just have that competitive drive. And you know, not trying to put Caitlin Clark in that same conversation as those legends, but you know, I think that's what we love as basketball fans, is just seeing somebody go out there and give everything they have every single night, and just being able to play with that passion and play with that drive. And Caitlin Clark does that every single night whenever she goes on the floor.
You know, it's funny you bring up the Michael Jordan thing, because I wrote a piece about Caitlin Clark recently, and I said it's kind of like and this kind of leads into her declaring for the draft, but it's kind of like that Michael Jordan vibe where Jordan entered the league when the Celtics and the Lakers were dominant. And you could kind of argue that's the Liberty and the Aces, you know. So it's a situation where she's like this transcendent type player that's really entering the league in the time where you have two very dominant teams, you know. And obviously, you know, Seattle has made some moves this summer, and it seems like we're kind of building up the narrative here in the WNBA. But before we get to that, of course, she did declare for the draft. She did have another year of eligibility that she forgot, so that she could have taken advantage of the COVID year stuff, but she did not, and decided she wanted to go to the WNBA. First of all, were you surprised that she declared? And second of all, presumably the number one overall pick is going to be her going to Indiana to play with Aaliyah Boston. What do you expect from her as a professional?
Well, I wasn't surprised at all. I've been saying all year because I know there's the rumblings about her possibly staying an extra year, but I was saying like, this is the best opportunity for her to go into the draft. I mean, she is showing us that she is one of the more complete players, and we want to see her excel at the next level. And it's true. I'm sure everybody knows it. The number one overall pick. I mean, that's just inevitable. She's going to Indiana, and I think that dynamic is just going to be so incredible when you talk about Caitlin Clark, Aaliyah Boston, but not only those two, but you still have Alyssa Smith, you still have Kelsey Mitchell, who everybody knows was a star at Ohio State, and just a dynamic young team. Because even though I can't remember exactly the Fever's record off the top of my head last year, but they had some good stretches throughout the course of last season. I know that they may have not closed out the season on a good note, but they had moments where they showed that this team is on a rise and they can become top tier contenders. But that 1-2 punch with Caitlin Clark and Aaliyah Boston is just going to be super spectacular. And I think one thing that I noticed last season that I feel like we didn't see enough of is we didn't really see a lot of Aaliyah dominance. And even though she did win Rookie of the Year, she did really play great. But I feel like she could have went to another level. And I think that all comes down to really lacking a playmaker, really allowing her to get post touches, in the mid post or on the low block. Because when Aaliyah catches the ball, if she can, when she's able to score and play make, the team is a lot better, and she's so efficient on the floor. So now you have a Caitlin Clark who's capable of doing that, and they can feed off of one another. They can play impossible pick and roll and pick and pop action because Aaliyah moves so well without the basketball. Same thing with Caitlin Clark. Caitlin Clark, even though she's super magical with the basketball, she's actually really good at moving without it. So I'm just really excited as far as what those two can bring to the table. Do I expect them to become top tier playoff contenders right away? No, I don't believe so. But now adding Caitlin Clark, now with the Fever having back-to-back number one overall picks, it puts them in the right direction. So I'm just excited about that as a whole.
Yeah, you could kind of see they're developing into this young upstart, right? Where kind of like the Oklahoma City Thunder were in the Durant and Westbrook early years, right? And they're kind of challenging the established players in there.
Let's just hope Indiana doesn't mess us up like OKC. Let's just hope they don't do that.
Yeah. Let's hope that, right? And Indiana, what's so cool about her going there? One, she stays in the area, so to speak. Obviously, she's from Iowa, so she stays in the Midwest, which is awesome for her. I think that is probably a factor for why she declared.
And also, one thing I'll say, I had a chance to go to Indiana last summer and go to a game. Indiana's a real basketball city. Like they thrive and they really appreciate the game of basketball. So I think her going to a city like that, because I mean, I know that she's been homegrown, being in Iowa for most of her life, but now that she's going to a real basketball city like Indiana, who cherishes the game and who loves the history, I think that's going to be really good for her.
Yeah, and they're a culture there. There's a culture there. I'm from New York City, so we have a different kind of street ball basketball culture. Indiana, it's that high school game, that playing in the garage, and they have an appreciation. That's why they loved Larry Bird so much when he was there, obviously, for the Sycamores in Indiana State. But let me ask you this. So there was a couple posts out about her already receiving odds to win MVP, like plus 2,100 on certain sports books. Do you think that she's kind of entering the league and is already in conversation to be the face of the WNBA as a rookie?
I believe so, and I honestly hate that they're putting that pressure on her because, and let's be honest, I mean, what we're seeing with her in college is incredible. It's something that we've never seen before. So I mean, her dominance is definitely great. And do I believe that she will excel at the next level? Of course I do. She's an incredible all-around talent, but I think people just have to allow her to just go through that journey of transitioning from college to the professional level because it's a totally different thing. I think people are just automatically assuming that she's going to carry the same dominance into her first season at the WNBA. Now, look, she will have a good WNBA season as a rookie, and I do believe that she can possibly win Rookie of the Year award. But will she come in and be the face of the league? Will she win MVP? Will the Fever automatically become championship contenders? I don't believe that whatsoever because I do think that she will hit a rookie wall. But I do also still think that she's going to shine. So I think that's just really the media And I think that's a lot of fans that are just putting that pressure on her, but are also having really high expectations from her. And I think that she will eventually exceed those expectations, but I just don't think that it's going to happen right out the gates as people expect.
So what interests me about Clark a lot is we've had a lot of really good college players come
Right.
through these last like 4 or 5 years, right? And they like you go through the history of multiple programs like UConn, for example, Stanford, South Carolina. They've had all these great players that went on to be really good in WNBA, but it seems like none of them have really captured everybody's kind of interest like that. So, what do you think? Is there like a special sauce to her that is making it so that she has that appeal, or is it really just the evolution that we're kind of getting more familiar with the women's game, or like what do you think is the secret sauce outside of her being great? Because like Maya Moore was great, Sabrina Ionescu was great in college. Like all these players are great in college, but what makes Caitlin a little bit different?
I think it's a combination of her greatness and then
Mhm.
also her coming in at the right time as we're
Yeah.
seeing the evolution of women's basketball. Because I mean, it's like you mentioned, like Maya Moore was like early 2010s, Diana Taurasi, Sue Bird, they were in the early 2000s whenever they transitioned from college to the WNBA. So they were always great, and for all real fans, we understand their greatness. That's why I love to go back and just watch the games, just because I just
Mhm.
remember just watching during that time and how great it was. But I think now with the women's game growing so rapidly, whether it's college or whether it's the WNBA or even high school per se. I think that she's coming in at the right time, and just her style and just being able to stand out and be herself. I think that's just something that plays a role as well. So I think that's really what it is. So and I think that's why a lot of people hold a lot of pressure on her, and it's like it's like for instance like when LeBron had came out of high school, and that was that immediate pressure. So that's just something that I'm afraid of, is that I just don't want people to put that pressure on her to just exceed everything. And then next, like for instance, like if she doesn't win Rookie of the Year award, people are gonna say, "Oh, she's a bust," and it's like, no, it's not necessarily that. It's just like making that transition is not easy. The only player that we've actually seen actually dominate out the gates, in my opinion, from like as far as a rookie, was Candace Parker, who won an
Mhm.
MVP in 2008. But even then, even when she won the MVP award, I still knew that Candace could take her game to another level. I mean, she was still young. She was like 22, 23 at the time. So Caitlin is going to be that same way. Now, like I say, if Caitlin doesn't win an MVP, if she doesn't win Rookie of the Year, that doesn't mean that she hasn't exceeded expectations. I think that one day she will go down as one of the greatest to ever play. That's just my opinion. But
Mhm.
it's just going to take some time. I think people just have to understand that that it is a journey, and it's going to take a lot of people time, to be able to really get their career, to the level that they wanted to. I mean, I can mention other names like it's crazy. I saw something on SportsCenter the other day, like Michael Jordan didn't win his first championship till like 27, 28 years old.
Right.
Same
Yep.
thing with LeBron James, same thing with like a lot of guys, Shaquille O'Neal and others. But we look at these guys as few of the greatest to ever play. I mean, you could say the same thing with the W. Diana Taurasi didn't win her first title till I think like year 5 or 6 or something like that. So it just takes a lot of time, and even Asia Wilson didn't win till like year 5 or 6, I'm gonna say.
Mhm.
So it just takes time, as far as, really building yourself and really establishing yourself as the best. So yes, Caitlin Clark has a capability, but I think people need to allow her to have that time to be able to adjust and just being able to really establish herself.
So let's pivot a little bit to the WNBA as a whole, right? Where we've had an increased level of interest. This past All Star game of the NBA, we obviously had the 3-point shootout between Steph Curry and Sabrina. We've seen a lot of support from the NBA players for their WNBA counterparts, and it seems like there's a little bit of momentum. Do you think that some of that is because a lot of these players are in college longer? Obviously, like NBA, it's all one and done. Guys go straight to the G League. In women's ball, it's 3-4 years. You establish a brand at a big college like a UConn, like a Tennessee, and like whatever name a big women's program you could think of. And do you think that's kind of led to them being more identifiable when they get into the league? Whereas, you get examples like Jonathan Kuminga for the Warriors. He went straight to the G League. He was a lottery pick, but no one knew who he was, right?
Right.
But now they know, right? They've watched the games once he's gotten to the league. But in the W, you got household names who have gone to these big ticket programs and been there multiple years, and they've kind of like Angel Reese at LSU is an example. Like when she goes pro, she's going to be very identifiable. people love Angel Reese for that reason. So do you think that that's kind of contributed to an upward swing in the popularity of the WNBA?
I do believe so. And, and you talk about how they play for these story programs, like, for instance, we talked about Maya Moore. She played for Coach Gino. Players like Asia Wilson, Aaliyah Boston, and others, they play for Coach Don Staley. So I think them going to these top tier programs definitely does play a role. And that's one thing that I want to say is that having those 4 years is very important, because I know they've argued about the women should be one and done, the women should be one and done, and that might change soon, because when you talk about how much the game has just been able to to evolve, we've been talking about Caitlin Clark, but we can talk about Juju Watkins, who is dominating right now as a freshman at USC. We can talk about Hannah Hidalgo, who's been dominating the same way at Notre Dame, and just so many other players who at 17, 18, 19 years old are proving themselves right now to be pro ready. So, that might change in the near future, but also the W has to expand a lot more, because there's still limited roster spots. So, hopefully that's something that we can see possibly in the near future. But also another thing is that I think also having 4 years is very important, because, and that's one thing that I want to say about a lot of men players too, is that, sometimes one and done is not necessarily meant for everybody. And that doesn't mean that you're a bad player. It doesn't mean that you can't potentially be an all-star in the league one day. It's just that sometimes you need those extra years to be able to identify yourself and just being able to establish yourself as a player that you may want to be, and just figure out how, and also reach a certain level of maturity as well before you enter the professional level. So I think having those 4 years is definitely important. Like, for instance, and then of course, the accolades as well. We talk about Angel Reese and how she was able to win a national championship last year. And then once she won that title, how she became such a big megastar. She has a lot of these NIL deals and everything. So it even got to the point where she couldn't even go to class in person anymore, because she was such a big name on campus. So, so I think that also plays a role as well. But I think one of the biggest things for me is, these players getting 4 years in college and just being able to really dominate at that level. So now they transition to the W, so they're already a household name, and, they can just carry on what they left off in college into the pros.
Now, that's a huge point, right? Because you kind of, you develop, and you think about, I always would say, for every Kevin Garnett in the NBA, there's 10 Sebastian Telfairs, right? Guys who just didn't work, right, for whatever reason. I was working on a piece about the Clippers recently, and I was diving into Darius Miles' career, another guy who came straight out of high school, and a lot of times it's just bad situations. And what you've seen in the NBA is guys who came in the 2020, 2021 draft, their teams aren't being super patient with them. A lot of those guys are gone, within a few years, right? And so I think there's a turnover aspect in the NBA, whereas in the WNBA, you're building up your brand here in women's college basketball, and then it makes the product more exciting to watch. I think you mentioned Juju Watkins. I'm tuning into, I'll watch a USC or just a women's game, Pac-12 women's game out here on the West Coast much more before I'd watch a Pac-12 men's game, just because, there's brand names there. There's, identifiable pieces. If I turn on a Caitlin Clark game, right, that's the person I'm tuning in for. If I tune into Michigan State, Ohio State, it's a bunch of guys I'm not super familiar with, right? Until you get to March, and then you start really clunking in. But I do want to say there's one thing ask about this thing with the WNBA. We kind of alluded to it already. It seems like there's a little bit of a super team dynamic going on right now, and obviously the Liberty and Aces met in the finals, and they both loaded up the previous offseason. This offseason, Skylar Diggins-Smith going to Seattle, they're loading up, and it seemed like they're going to be in a rebuild after they lost Brianna Stewart to the Liberty, but now they kind of seem like they're kind of retooling and maybe become that third team in the league here. Do you think having these stacked rosters is good for the league?
I think it's dope, honestly. I know a lot of people. I know that we like to have a certain level of competitiveness. So we like to have stars, and separate teams and everything. But I like it. I like that teams are able to figure out ways to to regroup and just figure out how to elevate themselves as title contenders. You mentioned Seattle. They lost Brianna Stewart to New York Liberty. They lost Sue Bird to retirement. Last year they went 11-29, I believe, and that was with Jewel Lloyd being one of the best scorers in the league. Now they're able to regroup, but that's also the important thing as well, is that the front office, they understood, hey, we have an elite scorer right here in Jewel Lloyd. who is still in the prime of her career, who understands how to win because she has 2 titles. So now, like, let's figure out a way to possibly get her some help and help her figure out how to win again. So what do? They grabbed Skylar Diggins-Smith, who had a situation out of Phoenix. She missed all last season, and now they signed her. Then a little while later, they signed a former MVP and former champion, Neko Gumike. So I'm a real big fan of it. And I'll be real, Seattle has always been like one of the more storied franchises in the W.
Yep.
They won multiple titles, whether it was Sue Bird and Lauren Jackson, and then transitioning later on to Sue Bird and Brianna Stewart. So now this is a new era in Seattle. And it's also part of the reason why people want an NBA team to be back in Seattle. It's just because of that atmosphere. Just like as much as they love basketball there. So I love it. I think that it's good for the league. Obviously, you have the aces. They're still led by Asia Wilson, who I believe is the best player in the WNBA. Mm-hmm. But then you also have a dynamic of other players, with this Chelsea Gray, in my opinion, who's one of the best point guards in the league. Jackie Young, Kelsey Plum, like we mentioned earlier. They just re-signed Candace Parker, who is undecided whether she's going to retire after this year. If you ask me, I believe that she is, but who knows? Mm-hmm. But even then, Candace still plays such a huge role in this team. I mean, they were 18-2, I want to say, before she ended up getting hurt, and then she ended up missing the rest of the season. And even then, they were still able to win the title. So I'm just thinking, man, like, could you imagine a fully healthy Candace Parker throughout that season? Right. And what she would have been able to provide on the floor for the Aces whenever they got to the finals. And then you go to New York. New York, I'm glad that they ran it back, because there was rumors about, because I want to say Brianna Stewart, she was a core player. John Cole Jones was an unrestricted free agent. Luckily, they were able to keep John Cole and keep Stewie, but then you still have Courtney Vanderbilt, so you still have Sabrina UNESCO, and then you still have a great supporting cast surrounding those 4 players. I love it. It was year 1 for them. They had a good record, but they were still trying to figure things out throughout the regular season, and as many super teams should. But they were able to figure it out. It was part of the reason why they got to the finals as well. So I'm glad that they're running it back. Oh yeah, I can't forget to mention Benaja Laney, because she's such an important role on that team as well. But I'm glad that they're running it back, and let's see if they could possibly try to win that championship. So I'm happy that that we have these super teams. I know that people love the balance, and that they love to have certain stars in certain places, but it is not even just those teams, honestly. Connecticut, they're still going to be contenders. The Atlanta Dream, I think that they're going to elevate as top tier playoff contenders. So there's still a little bit of balance. I know that people are paying attention to the super teams, but there are still some good teams out there that people should keep an eye on.
The funny thing is like, everybody always says, I want parity, I want parity, I want parity, right?
Right.
But think about, like, again, using the NBA as an example, probably the most league parity that we ever saw was in the 70s, right? And that's where like 7 or 8 different teams won the title over the course of that decade. Like the Knicks won twice, the Blazers won in that era, and it was kind of the Sonics won, talk about Seattle. But it's probably one of the most forgettable eras in the NBA history, because ultimately in basketball, it's a game of dynasties, it's a game of stars, right? So I look at the situation right now, and I think it reminds me a lot of the 80s, right? Where, you got the Aces and the Liberty are kind of like the Celtics and the Lakers. The Storm here are going to be a little bit kind of like the Sixers, like really good, but maybe a little level below. And
Sixers or the Pistons or whatever.
You're right, exactly. And then you could envision the Fever kind of being the Chicago Bulls when Jordan got there in the mid 80s. And so I think it's good. Right, I think that it creates rivalries, because right now, you think about it again. You mentioned AJ Wilson and Ionescu and John Cole Jones, all these people, and it's like these are the name brands of these 2 franchises that could very well end up in the finals again this year, and that's, I think, good for the league. But I do want to kind of close on this one topic, Nick, and I wanted to ask you this because I remember a while ago, my brain's weird. I just remember random tweets that people that I like have posted over the years. So I remember a while ago, you had hit a follower milestone, and you had kind of remarked how people would kind of give you a rough time about being into women's sports and women's basketball. And I kind of want to talk to you a little bit about that experience, and why is it, in your view, that people are so critical of women's basketball in particular? Is it simply a sexism thing? Is it Like, what do you think it is? Is it something where, like, one thing I thought about recently, I saw an Instagram post of Sabrina Ionescu, and it was her on the court, right? Just made a three celebrating. And then it was another one, she was at like a fashion show. So she was all had the makeup on, dressed up, whatever. And people were like, oh, she can do both. And I thought to myself, they would never do that about a WNBA or NBA player, excuse me. Like
Yeah.
they like Shea Gilgeous-Alexander is known for being like a fashionable guy.
Fashion.
Yeah, no one's take a picture of him like and put him next to himself on the court. Like, oh, Shea could do both, but they're doing it with Sabrina. So, what's like your take on the way that the wider audience kind of views women's basketball as a whole?
I think it's a combination of a lot of things. I think some people are very sexist. You know, I'll say, you know, I mean, we mentioned earlier, you know, with Michael Porter Jr. and the pivot about how they should lower the rims because they don't dunk a lot, or just, you know, them saying that the women's game is just not as exciting. But, you know, I think there's a lot of things. I just think that people, I don't know, there might be some certain people out here that are not ready to accept the fact that women can't dominate. And I'll be real, I think that we're in the era of women. You know, not even just in the WNBA, but, you know, you talk about Sha'Carri Richardson and what she was able to do in track. You talk about what's her name, Coco Gauff, I think it's in tennis, I want to say, and how she was able to dominate as well. So I think we're just in a different era. And honestly, even, you know, for even hip hop fans, you know, a lot of the women have been dominating.
That's a great point. Yeah.
So I mean, I think right now we're in an era of women where, you know, where they are taking over. And it's not saying that the men haven't made their contributions, because they definitely have, but I think we're in an era now where we're seeing a lot of women, you know, being able to take center stage and just being able to dominate. But as far as, you know, my journey watching women's basketball, I mean, I can recall. So I mean, I'm a little younger than everybody. I was born in '98. The W was formed in '97. So I missed out on a lot of those years. I missed out, you know, watching the Comets winning titles. Even like, you know, with Lisa Leslie and the Sparks, you know, when they were able to dominate during their time. Even like the Detroit Shock with Deanna Nolan and Swin Cash and the rest of their crew, you know, when they were able to dominate as well. So I missed out on a lot of those years. My first finals that I watched, I actually remember, it was 2010. It was the Seattle Storm and the Atlanta Dream. So you had Lauren Jackson Suberg going up against Angel McCoughtry, and that was a fun series as a whole. So, you know, I just remember, you know, being able to watch that. And then I remember even the later years when the Minnesota Lynx had won titles, and, you know, we saw Candace Parker and the Sparks, you know, they were on the rise. And I just remember, you know, being like during that era. And it's two things that I noticed too. I mean, obviously, you know, having friends and all that, you know, they used to clown me, you know, and criticize me for watching the women's game. And even I just remember, I think I was watching the New York Liberty game. This is like 2011, 2012. And I just remember watching the game and just looking in the background, and like there was a lot of empty seats out there. Like this is like mid-second quarter and everything. I was like, dang, you know, nobody's at the games. So now fast forward into 2024. And now, you know, you watch a women's game, and it's like you look at all the ratings, and you look at all the numbers. It's like for instance, like the national championship last year had 9 million views, and you go and watch the games, and like, you know, literally every seat is filled. So it's like it just shows how much the game has grown. And, you know, I think about that a lot, about how just 12, 13 years ago I was watching a women's game and there was nobody really tuned in, to now in 2024, you know, everybody's tuned in. So that's why I'm a really big fan of the evolution, man. And, you know, I think for, you know, just regular basketball fans who appreciate every aspect of the game, you know, they're understanding that, you know, that these women can play. It's like, for instance, I don't know, I just started thinking about this, but the rapper Plies, you know, we see how big a South Carolina fan he is, and, you know, how he went to the game with a crock pot. He ended up naming the point guard Raven Johnson after a crock pot, because she just mixes everything together.
That's
and
funny.
Exactly. So, I mean, but it just shows how passionate people are starting to become of women's basketball. And I'm just a fan of it overall, man. And, you know, you got to think the W is in year 27, 28, I believe. So, and people got to remember, you know, the NBA, you know, even in like, it took like 40, 50 years for it to really jump off, you know, to really become, you know, what it was. You know, I mean, I remember hearing stories about, you know, players in the 60s, you know, they were still working full-time jobs and, you know, still having to go to basketball games and still playing at a professional level. So, you know, I think the W is going to have to go through that same thing. You know, I've seen a lot of people, you know, they try to compare the two, but it's like, I think the W has to understand patience and just understand that things will come as time. But I think right now, over the past few years, we've seen a lot of progression, and, you know, in 10 years, you know, it may be bigger than what it is now.
Yeah, that's a great point. You know, you think about the early days of the NBA back in the 50s and 60s, you know, it was obviously a different climate socially, right? But I mean, one could argue, you know, like the way that minorities were treated back then is kind of how it's the same spirit that people treat women with a lot in today's society. And we're looking at a situation here where the league is slowly growing, and I think because of the timeline of when the league plays, right? It plays in that spring-summer timeline where who's your competition really? Your competition is the NFL draft, right?
Right.
And of course baseball and a little bit of MLS. So I've long thought that both the WNBA and the MLS are positioned to take over that time of the year because baseball is a little bit of a dying sport in the sense of the average fan base age, right? It's more of an older person sport now, right? And a lot of baseball fans are in their 40s and 50s, if not older. And, a lot of younger people really aren't gravitating towards it like they do football or basketball. So I think the WNBA is in a great position. Of course, they're in the great position too of somebody like Caitlin Clark jumping into the league. And then every year it seems like there's another person who's coming in who's really interesting and who you kind of develop a must-see TV type aspect. But Nick, I really appreciate you jumping on for this first episode, this first interview with me. Always a pleasure talking with you, man. And, hopefully we could do it again soon sometimes. I don't know if you got something to plug, any upcoming content coming up that you want the people to check out.
Yeah, man. First and foremost, man, thank you for having me on. Once again, it's an honor to be the first guest on the show. I'm excited to see where you take this pod as a whole. I'll definitely be tuning in, and whenever you need me to come on again, I'm always down. I'm always down to come on. But as for me, follow me on X at NickAndreATR. For those who may not be familiar with me, I'm a basketball writer, content creator, covering everything from high school to the pros. That's both men and women. I write a lot, so make sure to be in tune for whatever I have coming up. But then also, be able to check out. I have 2 podcasts. For the love of the game, make sure to check that out. New episodes every Thursday, and then I have a newer podcast as well. It's titled Believe in FSU Basketball, where I cover Florida State basketball, both men's and women's. So be on the tune for those, man. Once again, man, appreciate you for having me on.
Thank you, Nick, man. Love the work you're doing about FSU, and that's a program I think that doesn't get enough love. A lot of times we kind of think of Florida State as a football school, but they've been making a lot of waves in both women's and men's basketball over the last decade. I want to say, especially like with all the NBA talent that they've kind of churned out here over the last decade in the league. So definitely be on the lookout for that. Thank you everybody for tuning in for this episode of the Deep Cover Podcast. You can check this out on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, and on Substack as well. Until next time, we will see you then. Nick, thanks again, and peace out, everybody.
Yes, sir.